He reduced the number to zero, and because he made everything about looking outside of yourself and finding purpose. So he was pretty bold. He would walk up to some of his patients and say, and who were really struggling. I don't know if I would follow this method, but he would say, "So why don't you commit suicide? You're thinking about it. Why don't you commit suicide?" And they would say things like, "Well, I still have some kids at home, or I have something I said I was going to finish." And then once I finished that, he says, "All right, whatever they would say to the answer of that question," he says, "well then, now drill down into that." And he talked about how whoever has a big enough why can endure almost any how. If you have a why to live for, if you have a reason to get up in the bed in the morning and go help somebody, go serve somebody, go do something for somebody, he called that logotherapy, which just means finding purpose in what you're doing. So, just thought I would do a little book report as we're waiting for people trickling in here online or in person. So, all right. Well, welcome everyone. Hopefully you got a handout on the way in. Why don't I begin with prayer, and then we can jump into our study, okay? Let's pray. Lord God, thank you for bringing us here to study your word, but also study our emotional and spiritual life. I pray that what I would teach tonight would be in line with your word. Whatever comes from your word, I pray that we would remember, and whatever just comes from me or is not in line with your word, that we would quickly forget. And don't let me get in the way of your word. In your name we pray, amen. All right, so look at this. It's going to work tonight. So far we've talked the first, my story, God's story was our first night that we kind of met, and we looked at living in the present. Live in the present was kind of the key idea in that first thing, that when you look at your story and you look back, you see guilt and shame or things that happened to you in your past, and sometimes you can get stuck thinking about your past and ruminating over your past. Or because of your past, then you look into the future and you can be so filled with anxiety and fear about what's going to happen next. When's the other shoe going to be dropped? But we need to view our whole story, our past and our present, in view of God's great story, that he is in control, his redemption, the reality of his creation, the reality we live in a fallen world, and the reality that God is going to move us towards new creation. So that was my story in view of God's story, living in the present. Last week, we talked about the practice of self-awareness, this idea of our own personal spiritual battle based on nature and nurture. And so I had you do the Enneagram test, and I had you kind of look at that. And hopefully that was helpful, just kind of getting your number. What I like about the Enneagram, different than other personality tests, it shows you not only, the key idea of the Enneagram is that it shows you your primary motivation. What motivates you? I'm motivated by this thing. And then also that primary motivation can also lead to your unique struggle, your unique weakness. And so that's what we talked about there. And so we talked about practicing self-awareness. Be aware of your natural response to hard things. And sometimes just being aware of it kind of can help reduce some of this emotional and spiritual, kind of anxiety or fear. Like, oh, this is what I usually do because I'm this number. I usually go into this mode. I don't have to do that. And so just having some self-awareness. Tonight we're going to talk about fulfilling your responsibilities and the different crosses that we bear. It might have some overlapping ideas from the first episode or the first class. But what we're going to talk about tonight is understanding the different crosses that we bear at different stages of our life. And so it's similar to that first class, where the first class we kind of drew our story and thought about our background and thought about our past. Now we want to kind of make sense of some of the things that we might be struggling with at different times in our life. And so I'm going to use some graphics here from a book was written by a friend of mine, Sonny Mazar. Sonny Mazar was kind of my mentor in Winona, my previous city I used to live in, previous congregation. He was just a guy from the community. He was a pastor, but also did a lot of work in kind of encouraging pastors and counseling them, and I love Sonny Mazar. So I texted him recently and I said, hey, could I use some of your graphics from your book, Journey to Authenticity? And he gave me all of his graphics. He said, absolutely, use this stuff. And so I thank him. So if you want to drill down more into the information I'm going to be talking about tonight, you can find his book. The book is called Journey to Authenticity. Journey to Authenticity. Journey to Authenticity by Sonny Mazar. And I think maybe he might be watching this. I don't know if he is. I just want to keep thanking him. All right, so our purpose tonight is pay attention to the common stages of the Christian faith and how to walk through them with faith. So we want to pay attention to our struggles and what stage of life we're in and what's the unique struggle, and then to respond to that with purpose, respond to that with action. All right? So here's something from his book, Journey to Authenticity. And I don't know, you can see that on your sheet I handed out. Those of you who are following online, hopefully you can see this on your screen. I sent this out earlier as well. And what Sonny Mazar says, he talks about the different stages of faith. And when you look at that graph, doesn't that look a lot like the pictures that you guys drew the first night we were here? That looks kind of like what you guys drew, didn't it? I looked at many of you, like that's kind of like, yeah, I drew that. That's kind of what my life is like. All right, well, let's make sense of that now. Let's talk about these different stages. And this is kind of, it's not for everybody. It doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes you go through these stages quickly. Sometimes people go through these stages a bunch of times. But this is kind of just a common experience for the Christian walk. We're going to show this one, and then there's one that's a little bit different if you've gone through quite a bit of trauma. Your graph looks a little bit different. But the reason the first night we got together, the reason your graph, when I said draw out, what your life looks like, it looked like this, is because this is kind of the Christian life. So first of all, the first stage, according to Sonny, and there's been early church fathers who recognize this, Brother Lawrence, and the Dark Night of the Soul is a famous work. St. Augustine talked about these different stages. He says, the first stage is kind of awareness of God's grace. So it's kind of, you pass through the cross of God's grace. This is like when the disciples were on the shore and Jesus walked up to them and said, follow me. And they couldn't believe it. Jesus wanted them. Jesus called them into faith, called them in his family. Many people, this is their baptism. I think that for me, this is about 8th grade, where I remember listening to a sermon, and it was a guest preacher that day, and I just remember always being afraid to die, afraid of hell, and Pastor Stephen Hintz, who's now in heaven, Pastor Stephen Hintz, he was a teacher at Shoreland Lutheran High School. He just was preaching, and he seemed like he was talking right to me. He said, God loves you, he forgives you, and you don't need to be afraid to die. And for whatever reason, when I was in 8th grade, all the light bulbs went on, and I had this awareness that God not only loved generally people, he loved me too. And so for me, that was kind of 8th grade was that experience. Whenever that was, that maybe it's not your conversion. Maybe you go back to your baptism when you were a small child or things like that. But maybe there was this time in your life where you had a greater awareness of Jesus, like that God's grace was for you. It all started to kind of make sense. Now, in that life stage, a lot of times that happens for kids in their teens. This is kind of a teenage thing. Lots of times, not all the time, but teenage, 20s maybe. You also, the challenge, the cross you bear is receiving that and living in that, because you're in an immature faith at that time. And so you can start hanging out with the wrong crowd and kind of going back and forth. You're aware of God's grace, but you go back into old habits. And so the challenge is to keep on moving forward when you're a young kid, and to not get so confused. Your brain's not fully developed. You're not fully developed as a human being yet, and you're so desperate of finding identity, and you're so filled with hormones, right? That as a teenager, you can have the cross that you bear is just continuing to walk with Jesus and not fall backward back into that life before you really had this awareness of God's grace. And in the book of Proverbs, the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, Solomon is speaking to his son, and he's warning his son not to go into the same sins that he committed. And he goes back to 2 things. He says, beware of your hormones, basically, running, just living life for pleasure. And the second thing was beware of who you hang out with. He says that over and over and over again in Proverbs chapters 1 through 9. Chapter 1, he says, beware of the crew you hang out with. I know you're trying to find your identity and you're trying to find your new family, but be aware of that. And that's kind of that first cross that you have this awareness of God, but you're kind of, you could easily fall backwards because you still have an immature faith. Okay? Make sense? Thumbs up? Anybody have that happen to them, right? All right, then the next stage that Sonny and others have said is kind of this learner stage. And it's kind of like, it's usually, he describes it or draws it as these stairways as a way of saying, you learn more information, you kind of progress a little bit, you ask some more questions, and this is like 20s and 30s a lot of times where people start asking some questions and you start getting new information. And in your teens and 20s, you go through this learner stage in your walk with God, this faith life. And the temptation here is to just have head knowledge or to have some arrogance. Like, I know it all now, right? I mean, you do that when you're a teenager too, but you kind of come to this point where it's a lot of head knowledge. And what I loved about when Sonny Mazar, my mentor, would teach this, he would say, don't throw a wet blanket on them. You see it. They might get a little full of themselves. Somebody who's in their kind of learner stage, he'd say, let them go. Let them figure it out. Let them just kind of fill up their heads right now. Let them go through this process. Don't say it, well, it's more than just learning. Don't put a wet blanket. Let everybody pass through these stages and help them walk through them. So I remember going through this in college. I'm just eating things up. I'm reading things. I'm listening to stuff. I'm watching stuff on YouTube. I'm asking deep questions about, is God real? Is this for real? Are there other religions out there? What's true about Christianity? And I'm learning all of this stuff. I'm not really doing too much with it, but I have a lot of questions. And so that's kind of the learner stage. Again, the temptation with that is arrogance. The temptation is your faith is just knowledge. You might still be doing some of those, your life might not have really changed much because you're just learning. And so that can happen too. Does that make sense? Anybody feel that way? Anybody kind of experience that? Shake your heads, yes or no, maybe. I don't know. I've seen some yeses there. Okay. Then, after that, you go into this kind of what he calls warrior stage, and you maybe active stage, servant stage, where all of a sudden, like, you're on fire now. You've got it. You've learned some stuff. And now you see opportunity. You want to do something. And again, this isn't, maybe somebody doesn't go through these in the exact same order. Or maybe you go and you kind of go take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, stuff like that. But a lot of times in your 30s, you're kind of on the warpath. Not just with your faith, but maybe career. With your life, you're trying to set these big goals and you're doing stuff, and in your Christian life, you're maybe serving more and you're doing more. You're trying to hit these goals in your life. You're trying to make a name for yourself maybe. Your faith maybe becomes more action-oriented. And some of the temptations there is to get your priorities all messed up, to think it's all about you, think about it's all about your control, to think about it's all about your accomplishments. to look down on other people who don't seem as advanced and so, as you are. And so that can happen at that life stage, like 30s, and you can really be all about your goals and reaching them and all this energy and ambition. And again, Sonny Mazar, he would say, let them do it. Let them go through that warrior phase. Guide them. Be careful they don't turn into maybe arrogant situations or look down on other people or don't get off the rails. But a lot of times in these 30s and 40s, people accomplish great things in the kingdom. Like they raise lots of funds, or they grow a big church, or write a bunch of books. Maybe in your career, this is where you kind of climb the ladder and you do it in God's name and that kind of thing. So you go through this warrior stage. Anybody been through kind of a warrior stage before? Okay. And then it all stops working. And you hit what people have called the wall, midlife crisis, however you want to call it, and it goes like this. Where all those things that you were working on don't seem to work anymore. And you go through a period of brokenness. God seems distant. You are trying things that don't seem to work anymore. You don't seem to be, whatever, your career doesn't seem to give you the satisfaction, or maybe you lose your job and it doesn't work anymore. You hit this wall. And it's called the Wall of Brokenness. Now, this is probably the most important thing to how are you going to steward this up and down, like, time of brokenness. And sometimes you get, like, you kind of wake up and you feel like you're out of it. You feel like you had a breakthrough, and then something else happens, and you just are hitting this wall. And a lot of times that happens 30s, 40s, 50s, this midlife kind of crisis where these things that you put so much effort in, they're not seeming to pay off anymore. You maybe grew this church or ministry or business, and it doesn't seem to be helping as much anymore. Like, it just doesn't seem to matter as much anymore. You're starting to recognize that you're not going to be here forever. Maybe you have troubles with children or health. I remember my dad, I think this would be his kind of wall situation. He was 49. And he didn't tell us this, but he was praying, God, make me a better Christian. And he was kind of in this situation. He had lost his job. They downsized. He's working at a high-end job, and now he's helping out at a fast food restaurant after working a high-end job. And he's praying, I don't know what to do anymore. God, make me a better Christian. And he went to work that day, usually wore his helmet on his motorcycle, got in a motorcycle accident, flown flight for life, was in a nursing home in the hospital for months, and then nursing home for months. And then he told us when he got through all that, woke back up, got through rehab, he's like, I was praying that God would make me a better Christian. And I'm like, be careful what you pray for, right? That was just a wake-up call of like, all right. And now, he'll talk about this. He was very much kind of warrior stage for quite a while. I'm going to get this career. I'm going to take care of my kids. I'm going to take care of my family. We're going to do the church thing. We're going to do all these things. He put this all on his shoulders. And, when it got too much, I could just see the pressure on him. I mean, even as a young kid, I saw that. And after this, he doesn't raise his voice anymore, really. The control is gone. He just recognizes he's been through that wall situation. That's what this second cross is kind of called. After you go through the season of brokenness, really the cross of surrender, the cross of the wall, this cross of God, I don't know. I can't do it anymore. It's not working anymore, God. It's not up to me anymore, God, this surrender. And I don't know where I am right now. I feel like I'm somewhere in here. I don't know if I'm on the other side of this yet. I think I'm in those 30-year age, right? I'm kind of bouncing up and down here. And I think that's a really important time in your life to be careful on who you're surrounding yourself with and how you're walking through that. And so he talks about this. You can fall into this kind of pseudo spirituality where you can kind of fake it. You can kind of, when you're going through these crosses and this brokenness, you can kind of say, fake it, pseudo Christianity, false Christianity, where you just say the right things, but you don't actually believe it. Or you can fall into carnal Christianity, where God doesn't care, he doesn't listen anyways, why try? And just kind of give up. And you go this up and down brokenness stage until you get to surrender, really surrendering to God. And then hopefully on the other side of that is now authenticity, if you're able to walk through it. Authenticity meaning, this is who I am, I know who I am, I know who God is, and I know my place in God's world, and I'm going to walk with him and let him lead and let him go, and I'm not going to hold on so tight anymore. So these are some, I think, are really helpful. Anybody, does this make sense to anybody? Am I speaking everyone's language? I'm seeing some, okay. So those are all these steps I just said. It's on your folder, the handout I gave you. This idea of you have this cross of awareness of God's grace, kind of conversion, a cross of discipleship or growth, learner stage. Not the cross. This learner stage. Then you have this warrior active stage, this brokenness stage. Then finally you hit this wall, this cross of surrender. You let go of the control, and then hopefully you come into an authentic self. And a lot of times that authenticity is in your 50s and 60s, where you've seen it. And it's so good to talk to Christians who've been through all of this. They can just say, you're going to get there, and they can help steward you through some of those things. Some people go through this, feels like every couple of years, like they go through this whole process. So it's not just linear. You can cycle through it. You can go through many journeys, right? And I think that's true too, but I think it can be helpful just to identify some of these things. Now, a few years ago, I went to this class on, I don't have any background in my family or myself of any kind of abuse, but I talked to a man named Victor Frank, who's kind of leading prosecutor on child abuse and a Christian, and he gave this talk and he invited pastors to come to it. This was 7 years ago. Ever since then, I've seen like this is where we need to do ministry. Be around, because 1 out of 4 women have been abused, 1 out of 6 men have been abused. So a huge percentage, and those numbers might be low. That's in the best case scenario. And it changes your whole trajectory of what your life looks like. And so I just have a heart to keep bringing this up, to give people space to come out of the darkness and recognize that the majority of our congregations, the majority of the people have been through some kind of abuse in their life. You start saying this, and all of a sudden, like, everybody says, yep, that's me. Or that's my friend, or that's my neighbor, or that's my sister, that's my brother, that's somebody. And so this is what it looks like. It's a little different. The stages are the same, but they're a little bit different. You come to this new awareness of God's grace, but trauma and abuse just drops everything down. It's hard not to live in a despised self where you're just always heaping shame on yourself. Although it wasn't your fault, you continue to heap shame and guilt on yourself. And so you do come to a greater awareness of God, but look at you're way down here below the line. You're not up here as we looked before in this other graph where you kind of have an more ideal self. And you go through the learner stage, except learning about who you are and what that all means. The warrior stage, maybe it's got even more ups and downs. And it's hard to distinguish between warrior stage and broken stage. That just goes back and forth. And finally, you hit that second cross of surrender. God, I give it up to you. God, it's not up to me. And then the way Sonny Mazzar, he drew this diagram, lots of times that initial freedom can almost be a false freedom. And you still have some more work to continue to work into authenticity and continue to let go. And so sometimes it can just be he talks about not selfish freedom, more of I finally got free from myself, and then there's still a deepening. I need to continue to connect with the God who's still with me. So It might look different if you've had a different kind of story, just to be aware of that. It looks a little different for everybody, okay? So I think what I'd like to do now is continue to talk about this idea of the wall and this brokenness, this broken time where things aren't working anymore. A lot of times in your 30s and 40s, maybe even your 50s, this midlife kind of crisis situation, because it seems to happen over and over again, especially in God's Word, in the history. I think about Solomon in Ecclesiastes. Solomon was the third king of Israel. And Solomon, he did it all. And 700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,000 women in his life, tried to see how much pleasure you could enjoy. And all those those marriages were based on contracts with other nations to gain more land and more people. He had all the money. He had a big trade route come right through Israel and charged high taxes from coming through his territory. So it says that in the days of Solomon, gold was as common as silver. And so people are like, oh, that's just gold. We have that everywhere. It's like the streets were paved with gold in the days of Solomon. So he had accomplishments in building structures, and he tried to fill up as much pleasure with women and drink and alcohol and all this stuff. He tried to fill it all up, but he finally hit his wall. And the whole book of Ecclesiastes is kind of his wall moment. And this is what he says. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I think it's pretty clear this is Solomon. I applied my mind to study and explore wisdom, by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. And when he says, I have seen them all, he tried to experience them all. And I don't have time to read the whole book, but this is what he says. I tried to experience everything I could experience, right? And I've seen that they're all meaningless. Really, the literal is hevel in Hebrew, hevel, which means vapor. It's all a vapor. It's a chasing after the wind. And he finally comes to the conclusion in this book, you can do nothing better than to eat and to drink and to find satisfaction in your work as a gift of God. He comes to the point that life is not about chasing, about being a warrior, about a learner, about accomplishing a lot and making a name for yourself. He finally comes to this point, and a lot of times people come to this point on the other side of kind of burnout or a midlife crisis or whatever. Life is a gift. And no one can teach you that. Sometimes you have to experience that. Until everything is dropped away, you finally come to this point, life is a gift. And you want to shake up my teenage self and say, life is a gift, right? But you almost have to go through this whole thing till you come to that point where you say, life is a gift. And that's where Solomon gets to in this book. Another time that Paul kind of went through this wall, it seems like. Paul, the Apostle Paul was this guy who came to this awareness of God conversion experience in Acts chapter 9, where he used to he used to persecute Christians. And then Paul comes to this realization when Jesus meets him on the road to Damascus, that Jesus is real and the resurrected king. And he all of a sudden goes into learner mode the next 8 years. He spends, I think it's 8 years, he spends learning from the apostles and the writings and learns a bunch. Then he kind of goes into that warrior mode where he does 3 missionary journeys and he's reaching people all over the world and he's writing letters in the Bible and he wrote 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament. And God even gave him like visions of heaven, it sounds like, as he says in 2 Corinthians. But then he says, because of these surpassing and great revelations, these visions I had of heaven, all these accomplishments, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Whatever that was, we don't know. Some people think it was his weak eyesight. Some people think it was maybe grief or depression or whatever it was. He had some kind of wall that he hit. And he's crying out to God. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. So it seems like Paul goes through this kind of, hits this wall, hits this cross of surrender, cries out to God, God, take this. He says, I cried out 3 times. I don't think he just said 3 times, God, take this thorn from me. I think this is a symbolic way of he kept on crying out, pounding on God's chest like so many of the Psalms. And God never seemed to take away this cross, whatever it was, this thorn, but he came to peace with it, that he learned to trust in God's grace, that God's grace was sufficient for him. Okay? He came to this realization of God's grace. So if you're going through this kind of hitting the wall, this cross of surrender, what do you need? Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't finish that there. He says, for that sake, I delight in weaknesses. Now, that's unauthentic Christian. I delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulty, for when I'm weak, then I'm strong. You hear this authenticity in Paul's voice. You hear this surrender. But I don't know what else could teach him except for experience. He went through this journey. I don't know what else you could do, but he stewarded that. That's what he learned, okay? All right, so if you're going through this time of brokenness, if you're in this kind of period right here where stuff's not working anymore, what do you need? And this is probably what it's not just during this time. You need this your whole life. You need this in learner stage. You need this in warrior stage. You need this in brokenness stage. But this is really important. You see, if you don't steward midlife crisis well and this brokenness part well, you can never get out of it. You stick into it. You stay in it for a long time. So what do you need? You need Jesus, first of all, right? And Jesus, we hear his voice even in the Old Testament when David sings this song, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. I shall not be in want. The Lord is my shepherd. And so what does a person need? Well, obviously they need Jesus. Now, what does that look like, though? It looks like having this hope. You have this hope in Jesus. And so Paul talks about this. He says, indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us. So as you're going through these deep, dark moments, it's an ancient idea. This goes back to the early Christian church. When you're going through the dark night of the soul, it's called. When nothing seems to make sense anymore. When you just feel empty, your Christian faith, God seems far away. Paul says, we still have hope. We don't rely on ourselves, but on God. And he has delivered us in the past, and he's going to deliver us again. And so what do you need? You need hope. You need Jesus, and you need hope. And so that's why in that first night, we talked about this at kind of a 30,000 foot level, that hope of the resurrection, the hope of God's story, the hope of the grand narrative that God is pushing everything in creation towards new creation, towards resurrection. The hope that the God who rose from the dead on Easter is going to raise our bodies on the last day. That's what you need. So that's why we started out with that narrative, that grand narrative of hope. But you need it specifically, especially when you're going through this kind of crisis of faith. Okay? And you need this hope at every level. You need this hope when you come to faith. You need this hope as you're learning. You need this hope in warrior stage, but especially when stuff doesn't seem to make sense anymore. Okay? You need purpose. As people were walking in, I was giving my favorite book outside of the Bible is A Man's Search for Meaning. And then one of the best-selling Christian books of all time, The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren. Basically, he riffs off a lot of this idea of that Viktor Frankl found out that we all need purpose. We're purpose-driven creatures. We need a reason, people to help, someone to serve, something to do. If we can see purpose in our sufferings, if we can look outside of ourselves, that's what we need. The more we spend almost introspectively, sometimes we can continue to just hold on to our sadness, hold on to so many things. And so we need to continue to say, not what is my purpose, because sometimes we don't know, but just believe that I have a purpose, and then whatever's in front of me is today's purpose. There's lots of purposes. This kid that's in front of me, this person who needs my help is in front of me. We need purpose to get us out of bed in the morning. That's what Paul says when he was in jail in Philippians. He said, I might die. I'm in jail, they could kill me. But, and he says, if I die, I'll depart and be with Christ, that's better by far. A lot of faith right there, right? But, he says, if I'm going to go on living, even if I'm chained up, that will be fruitful labor for me. This is the verse I like to speak, especially when I go visit people in nursing homes, because so often in nursing homes, people feel like I don't have any purpose anymore. I don't have anything to do anymore. I don't have anyone to help anymore. And I love this verse as Paul says, if I'm to go on living, if God gives me another day, I have a reason. I have somebody to help. I have something to do. And we need to remember that, especially when we're kind of in this wall, hitting this wall, when we're in this brokenness stage, we need to remember, all right, I still have purpose. God, there still is a calling. I need to keep remembering that, okay? What we also need is a friend and I would say a good Christian counselor. This has been so helpful in my journey. Meeting with, I go to Christian family services, and I have Pastor Bill that I can counsel with, and Pastor Ben Zock from St. John's, a good friend. I have a pastor friend, Ben Bloomer, in the cities, and other friends that I can call up. Sometimes you need a good friend. Everybody needs somebody they can just totally say everything that they're thinking about. And I think a good Christian counselor, you could add in there, I would say, a pastor. I think we sometimes jump too quickly to secular counselors, as important as they are. And hear me say that, as important as they are, I think going to a pastor that you trust is a huge thing too. So the book of Proverbs says this, and I just love this. Listen to this. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. A brother and a friend is supposed to be there at times of adversity. And sometimes you just need someone to be there with you, not to give you any more advice, to just sit there with you as you're working through this kind of time of brokenness and challenge. Okay? So we all need somebody who's going to stick with us in time of adversity, time where things aren't working anymore, where maybe the job's not working anymore, the marriage isn't working, the life's not working, and we just need a friend to stick with us. Our faith isn't working. We don't, somebody almost has to believe for us when we can't believe anymore, just to stick with us and hold our hand until we get on the other side of that. And then finally, you need a community of believers. This is one of my passions and goals, is that we would continue to build community in our Christian churches, that we would have groups of friends that gather around us, that we don't just have one person we can lean on, but that we have a community of believers. And it's kind of been really neat to see these breakout groups here in our ministry center, and the breakout groups and Zoom, that you guys can start to have a community of people that listen to you and that you can listen to them. And that, again, comes out of 1 Corinthians, talks about us being a body of believers. In Romans 12, Paul uses the same thing, like that we're a body and we have many parts and each part has a role. In this section in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul says, we are a body, and if one part of your body suffers, the whole part of the body suffers with it. So if I jam my toe or stub my toe, I can't say, oh, well, it's just my toe. At least the rest of my body's okay. When my toe hurts, my whole body hurts, right? And that's what it feels like when you're in a community of believers. When one person is suffering and is honest about the things they're going through, the whole body of believers suffers with you and absorbs that. And that's how Paul puts it. He says, but God has put the body together. God did this. He put the Christian church together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there would be no division in the body, but that each of its parts would have equal concern for each other. So there's no hierarchy in the family of God. The foot is just as important as the hand. We're all part of the body of Christ. We're all members of God's body. Jesus is the body of Christ. That's the church. If one part suffers, if one of the parts of the body suffer, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, everybody has a party. We all rejoice. Okay? Whew, that's a lot of stuff. So hopefully what happens is, if you can steward these stages of faith well with help, on the other side of this, not perfectly, and it sometimes, again, we make it in a nice little graph form. It's probably a lot messier than this. The things that come out of that is a person with some humility. If you've gone through this journey, kind of like I was saying with my dad, he's just chill now, right? You have some humility where you recognize, I'm not in control. You know what? And I'm not that important. I'm not that important. When you're in warrior stage, you think it's all riding on you. When you're a learner, you're like, I know all this information. And you just talk to some people who've been through this in their 50s and 60s, and I'm not that important. They have humility. There's some trust. You've been through it. All right, God, I've learned to trust in you. I didn't like what I went through. I didn't like all these different things. I don't understand it still, but I start to learn to trust God even when it's hard. You start to learn patience. You've been through the journey. And instead of hurrying up and trying to have control and get through all this, you start to have some patience. We don't need to be in a rush. You start to have thankfulness, because you've seen the emptiness of pursuing some of these things. That's what I mean by Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes says, you can do nothing better than to eat and drink and enjoy your work and be thankful. This is a gift of God. That's what Solomon seems to find on the other end of his midlife crisis was, I should just thank God. These are all gifts, all these things that I'm enjoying. Then you find some real joy that's not superficial and just emotional joy, but real, true joy. So that's to give us hope that if you're in the middle of kind of here, if you can get, there is hope at the end. And I think another thing that something like this does is, if you find yourself in here, it's not weird. If you find that your life looks something like this is kind of what your graph you drew the first night we got together, you're not weird. If you feel empty, or sometimes you don't feel like God exists, or where is he, or why is he answering my prayers, you're not unique in the sense of you're not the first person who went through this. And if we'd probably all share that with people and let people know, we'd realize that this is almost everybody's story in a different way. A lot more people are hurting than we think and need each other. Okay? All right. So now we have some discussion questions.